want to do and jump right in. Okay. Sorry. I think somebody is not unmuted. Okay. Um, so I think by now I saw about, I think it's like something in the region of 60 students of you guys presenting to me in your formative feedbacks. And this week, next week, some of you have sessions on Thursday. And I think it's great to see how many of you took advantage of that. I think if I just looked at the participants, the list of who joined today, I see there's a big overlap of those who did their feedback, and I hope it was really helpful. I have really enjoyed it, and I want to kind of reflect a little bit on like, okay, what are the problems I saw when I saw all of these presentations, and also a little bit like, okay, what did I basically base my tips, my recommendations on, okay? And I want to summarize this in this lecture. There's somewhat a lot of content here, and I think I would just kind of, if you have to leave at some point, I might do a little bit longer. Just leave, don't feel bad about it. I just want to kind of put everything I want you to know in this lecture, okay? But I will go through a lot of things very quickly because I just want to point you in the right directions, right? I don't want to repeat everything we did in the previous 9 weeks in all of the seminars, right? We did these exercises, we did this stuff with the purpose of understanding better, and this better understanding should also translate into better coursework, right? The coursework for me is just a means for you to kind of better understand the content, right? Okay. This is like just a quick reminder. I just want to say we did similar versions of this already, right? Especially in the seminars. We talked about in the beginning, we looked a little bit at problems. What are problems with problems? We're not sure if they exist. They're ill-defined. We're mixing problem and cause, right? Where somebody says, oh, my problem is the impact of this on that. And we're not sure, for instance, TikTok on body image or something like that. And it's really hard to know whether the body image we have is really influenced by TikTok or not. Not saying that it is not possible, but just saying like that's often a problem with the problem, that the problem mixes up the cause. We talked about this. I have to stop myself a little bit to not explaining this too much because we did that, right? The causes are too vague and they don't fit the problem. I think that's like where often kind of weirdly in a transition where people kind of forget about their problem and then have causes that are loosely associated with the problem, but not really directly. The other thing, what I mean by vague, we talked a lot about this last week in the seminars a lot, is when you have something like, oh, socioeconomic status or culture. These are too vague and say, what is it within socioeconomic status? What is it within culture that causes it, right? What if we break it down out of psychological ingredients that causes the behavior we want to change, right? I think the biggest problem, and I saw this, is like we talked about this in at length in our seminars, but it's also something that I saw repeatedly over the last week in this presentation, that the intervention are not related to the causes. One typical thing that I want to highlight is that some students of you that came to me, some of you guys came to me and said like, well, I want to do this problem. I didn't really look at the causes, but here's my idea for the intervention, right? And I would say, well, without knowing the causes, we will never know whether the intervention is suited to the problem or not, right? You really have to make sure that the cause and the intervention are linked tightly together. That's like probably one of the biggest problems, but we talked about this, we practiced this. I think you should be just kind of reminding yourself about this, okay? Let's look at some lessons from the formative feedback. And I just kind of go through them. I try to give some examples. I think some are self-explanatory, but I think one of the things like that I often see is that basically we think like when we look at other people, it's very easy to identify these problems, but don't really relate them to ourselves. So try to kind of like, even if you're watching this the day before you submit your coursework or 2 days before you submit your coursework, just to think about, oh, let's go through this again and see like, is any of these problems actually, or any of these like issues, can I kind of apply them to my own coursework? I think make sure that you're kind of thinking about yourself when you're going through this. One thing that I want to just kind of pause here and just say, I hope you kind of experienced this when we chatted about this, but I just wanted to kind of say before I critique and give this feedback and that feedback that I was really impressed by you guys. I've really enjoyed doing this. This was, I think, for me, not I think, this was the highlight for me of this semester. I enjoyed seeing your passion, your interest, your ideas, your creativity, and I think I was like, I really genuinely excited to read your interventions. And so I just want to say that even though I focus now on the issues, right? I focus on the problems I felt, that this by no means is a reflection that what I saw in the last week was bad. No, rather the opposite. I was really, really surprised how much good stuff there's, how much good ideas, how much empathy, how much understanding, and so forth, right? And everyone is on a different scale. Don't compare yourself to others. But I think I just want to say, well done. Okay, really enjoyed it. Already excited for next year. Already excited to read your interventions. Very, very cool. Just to kind of give you a little bit of a feel where we're at. Okay, so for some of you, this is kind of like a reminder of the things you're already doing well. For others who just started to think about this might be different. But overall, I was really, really impressed, and I think the quality was super high. So I'm kind of like just saying this kind of cautious. And I hope that you feel in these conversations that I have with you about your coursework, that you can feel my interest and my passion, my appreciation of what you're doing. Okay. So one thing I thought was kind of interesting, I had a conversation with one of the students. She's like, oh my God, I have barely nothing. And then I told her, well, this is actually not that uncommon. A lot of students came into these sessions yesterday or last week and said like, oh, I have very little. So I think you shouldn't feel bad if you don't have much at this moment. That's perfectly fine. I think if I kind of see, I think of 57, I counted formative feedback sessions I had so far, then I would say that there are 2 students where I basically told them, just write it up. This is perfect. Okay. And then I think basically and this is like, I don't even have a problem in everything in between. Okay. So wherever you are, you shouldn't feel bad about your timing right now. I mean, if you watch this the day before submitting your coursework, then maybe you're a little bit late. But I think it's just kind of like, don't feel bad about wherever your position is in this kind of journey towards developing your own intervention. And so there's like a widespread of how sophisticated, elaborate, and so forth these interventions are. But I think it's sometimes good to know what others are doing. Okay. One thing, just to kind of repeat this, I only had 2 students who had these problems, which is to say, okay, to remind you, please don't do anything clinical psychology. This is not clinical psychology. Most of the problems in clinical psychology are related to clinical psychology are best addressed, even if that's often not very effective, are best addressed by therapy. Okay, and so social psychology is not therapy, and please don't do anything about clinical psychology. If you kind of think about yes, so I have that several times. I said it several times. I think most of you are aware of it by now, but 2 students were not, which is also fine. Here's some solutions, right? You could do something like mental health prevention or resilience training for city psychology students. I would be happy if you do that. One student is doing that already. So because I would like to take that and then kind of apply that to you guys. I think that's a good thing where you think, okay, there's so much tremendous value to get from that. You can do that. And that would be helpful. I think you can reshift the focus. You can make it about stigmatization of stress, stigmatization of help seeking, so that all your research is not lost, right? I think there are like some phenomenon to that you can address, but please don't do anything that's kind of like addiction or like, I don't know, like anything, depression, anything like that, or mental health stigmatization. Okay, I said it several times. I think just to reiterate it, I have it several times bold on our website or on our Moodle page just to make sure. But here are ways to kind of, if you're stuck and you already invested some time to kind of reorient yourself. One thing I thought, like there are 2 things where I think like, okay, a common problem And I have some comments that I took here, but just like it's basically reinventing the wheel, the problem and the causes. So some of you guys kind of come in and they're interested in a specific problem within a specific context. Okay, I think one of you guys was interested in doing some with Savala, but one in particular I remember is like, and she said, okay, I want to do this in Saudi Arabia, but there's no research on this in Saudi Arabia. So I think in here it's like, hey, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. People in Saudi Arabia are very similar to people wherever the research was done, right? You can think a little bit about, obviously, is there something about the cultural context that might impact that and then implement that. But I think do not fret if it's not exactly the thing you're looking for. Sometimes it's like, oh, I don't know, I want to do something that's very niche in one area of England, but I don't know the research about this area in England, right? Do not worry about this, okay? You can extrapolate, you can, so for instance, let's say we take the example of Saudi Arabia and you want to do something about, I don't know, stress, okay? Or you want to do, yeah, let's take stress, right? There's not much reason to assume that the kind of fundamental laws, psychological laws that govern how we perceive stress are not the same in Saudi Arabia as they are in England, in Germany, or in the US, okay? Do not reinvent the wheel. Do not think like, oh, this is something different, but use the well-established research of larger areas and apply it to it, okay? So there's nothing about ours, like, oh, there's nothing about prejudice in this context, okay? Or this specific prejudice, okay? Just use what we know about prejudice and stereotypes in general and apply it. I think one student was like, oh, there's a lot of research on what's Facebook, but not on WhatsApp. I think don't just use whatever research there is that is most closely. If you have something where there's like a well-founded idea of why this is a problem, okay, then write that in there and like make your case. That's perfectly fine. But often I felt like, so why is this like, why is the WhatsApp, Facebook, Saudi Arabia, not England, I don't know, this prejudice, not that prejudice, really a problem, right? So think about the differences and if they actually matter, but in general, try not to reinvent the wheel, okay? Use really established. This is especially true for the interventions, okay? So sometimes I was like, oh, I think there's like stress in nurses. Or I think this was a good example. Or let's say you want to help, yes, like let's stick with stress in nurses, right? In the NHS. And the first inclination is to look for interventions for stress stress interventions for nurses in the NHS. Okay, I think this is not a good idea. So one thing is a little bit like here I have this kind of a little bit like funny example where imagine you would say like, oh, the doctor says like we want to treat cancer in Wales, in rural Wales, okay? But you can't find any studies on cancer in rural Wales, right? Oh, okay, so I don't know, what should I do, right? I'm stuck. Well, the laws that govern cancer growth in all over the world also govern them in rural Wales, right? And then sometimes, so why do I think you shouldn't Google the specific thing, right? Because often that leads to really bad interventions in kind of niche areas, right? So here it's like in my kind of like made up poor example, I said, oh, we found one study in a Journal of Rural Wales Health Promotion, and they use a whiskey massage in 5 participants, and the patients say it kind of helped them to feel better, okay? And so if you are in very niche, under-researched areas, often the research in these areas is not very good. And it's much, much better to just use the vast amount of research we did on a particular problem, here for instance cancer, and apply it to that area. Don't worry too much if in that niche it's not done, okay? We come back to that, but basically the intervention techniques that I taught you over the last 9 weeks, right, or last 10 weeks, these are the most effective ones, right? You should use these, not the whiskey rub, okay? So don't kind of use something really different and weird and kind of like, oh, but they say it kind of worked in this one study just because it does it exactly with your sample, okay? So stress interventions should look at stress intervention, should not look at stress intervention in NHS nurses. I think it's important to understand the context. We come back to that, but it shouldn't change the intervention, okay? So this is like one where it's kind of like in the beginning, people like, oh, they were stuck. I think a lot of students said like, oh, I'm stuck because I can't find either something about the problem, the cause, or the intervention in this specific area. Okay. The other was like, okay, so now we have some causes and we want to know. And I think there was a lot of kind of like a tendency to basically what I call here tell, not show. So if you identify, let's say, I think here just like one example that stuck to my mind is like where a person wanted to do something about, I think it was body image in teenagers, right? And so it's a little bit like, I know what I want to change. I want them to feel comfortable in the body they have, right? But the idea then here is basically to just tell them that, right? So it would be, let's say you identified that psychology lecturers are notoriously unhappy with the way they look, okay? So you would come to me and say, like, Andreas, I know you're struggling with your body image, but I want you to know you're beautiful, okay? I don't know if that would work. I would appreciate it, obviously, but it would just, right? If I have deep-seated anxieties and concerns and issues with my body, or I kind of worry about it, then a well-meaning telling you is not very effective. So ideally, and we come back to this, you want to show, not tell. You want to engage in a process that gets them to the impression that, hey, yes, I'm a psychology lecturer, and the body that I have, I should be comfortable and happy with the body I have, okay? So just to kind of remember that, right? If you have the idea where you want your intervention participants to be, of the meaning, don't just tell them that, right? So you have to kind of, that's why we have interventions, okay? This is like the process of getting them from point A, I don't like my body, to point B, I kind of like my body, okay? This is what happens here is, don't jump that by just saying, oh, and then we tell them, hey, you should be, you should be happy, that doesn't work, okay? There's a little bit like of a more sophisticated version of that, where it's like, okay, so let's say I want to help Andreas with his body issues, okay? So how can I do that? And then I said like, oh, what about if I invite other lecturers that are happy with their body and they talk about this, okay? There's very little evidence just meeting another person in an unstructured way, or did this person talking to me about the issue, which just adopt me, their kind of like their successful solution, right? So it's like, I don't know, it's like if Stian comes to me and it's like, hey, Andreas, did you know that I'm very happy with my body? That's not, it would not convince me. She's like, oh, now I'm happy with my body too. Stian is, okay? I'm not saying that meeting others it's often a good idea. It's a good starting point. But how can you structure this meeting of the other successful version? Or I think a lot of it's like, oh, I remember like one student, I think it was about homeless people, and it's just like, oh, they have problems emphasizing with homeless people. Why don't they just meet homeless people? It's like, it's a good first step, but what is happening in this meeting that ensures that you end up at the point where you want to end up? Okay, what are the activities? What do they talk about? How do I steer the successful version of the participants or the other in order to stimulate this kind of change of meaning? Okay, don't just let another person do your work. Right? It's a little bit like a different, which is like often it's like, oh, okay, you want to do group work or group sessions or websites, right? And I think the trap is often then to just say like, oh, okay, I want people to have more empathy for psychology lecturers. So they just meet psychology lecturers, or they have on a website where they can meet them, or psychology lecturers who are unhappy with their body image can share on a website their concerns about their body image, right? That's not a psychological intervention. Most of that stuff most likely exists often, for instance, with homeless people or with psychology lecturers not. But like, let's say with homeless people, we often meet homeless people. We have chances or interactions with them, okay? And still we lack empathy for them. So you have to kind of take that as a starting point, but don't then just let somebody else come in. It's like, oh, you do the persuasion, you do the intervention by kind of doing it in a group setting and everybody shares. Sharing might be good, but sometimes it might also not be good. Okay, it might be that everybody in the room realizes, well, I don't know, I'm doing drugs too. Oh, I'm doing drugs too. Oh, I'm doing drugs too. Okay, where do you get it? And then we're like in a different way, right? I can only think about, like, there was this idea, this is a clinical application, but a lot of research on psychopathy, right? There's basically no really efficient strategy or therapy for psychopathic patients. So they often would start young with like young psychopath. I think there's a new term now for I think opposing behavioral syndrome or something. And they would bring in a summer camp, all these kind of mini psychopaths. And they would then basically come back and have a lot of new strategies how they can manipulate others. It was like a training camp to making them more psychopathic, right? So this shows you that just bringing people together and let them talk about their problems might make it worse than better, okay? So don't just let others do your work, okay? Don't just say, and then we do a group session. Or, I think like one classic example last year is, which I'm urging you not to do, it's about mental awareness. And it's like, okay, so mental health stigmatization. Oh, there are young teenagers, they think it's uncool to have a depression. And now bring somebody in who had a depression and says like, hey, I had a depression. It's pretty cool. It's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't convince these students, right? That wouldn't work for you, okay? So I think that's like one of the biggest problems I saw. There's like some version of basically letting others do your work, right? You kind of almost define a structure. Oh, they meet in the morning, then they do this, they have a website, but the psychological content about these things are missing, okay? Another one is like where it gets a little bit more sophisticated now, okay? Let's say you already think, okay, what do I want them like to, how will I change their, for instance, perception of that? How can I increase their intention to perform a certain behavior? And then I said like, oh, you know what? I use the theory of planned behavior, okay? Let me kind of explain this a little bit. This is, if you remember this is from our first week one, this is a theory of planned behavior, right? You have attitudes, norms, and behavior control. So if I want to increase your intention to perform something, I have to, at least according to the theory of planned behavior, I have to increase your attitude to the positivity of your attitude towards that behavior. I have to change the norms, or I have to increase your behavioral control. So this is a really good starting point for some interventions if you think these are the issues, right? But now what students sometimes do is like, okay, in these workshops, we will talk about the attitudes, norms, and their control. And this is an intervention that is guided by the theory of planned behavior. So you feel like, well, I have a theory and I kind of say what's happening in the intervention, so I should be safe. But the problem here is that, let's say you want basically to kind of convince me to, what do I not like to do? I don't know. Let's say, imagine I wouldn't like running, okay? And you think like, okay, I have to convince Andreas that he should run more, okay? And then we say like, Andreas, did you know that running is really good for your body? And then it's also like other people run, and like your wife thinks you should run, and that might actually work, okay? Maybe like other people think that you should run, and I think you can run. So you addressed in your intervention all these attitudes, norms, and behavior control, but none of them in a psychologically convincing way, right? Just mentioning these three things doesn't make it that I change my attitude. If I hate running, you telling me that running is fun will not change my attitude. If you say others run, I'm just like, well, there are many other people who don't run, right? And yes, I can run, but I still don't want to run, right? Just addressing them is not enough. You have to think like, how can I change the attitudes with the techniques we have and I taught you in the last 9 weeks? How can we change the perception of the norms with these techniques? How can we increase the perceived self-control? Okay, so this is something where, and sometimes wise interventions is the same, where it's like, oh, I would use a wise intervention, and then we would talk about kind of meaning and self-integrity and so forth. This is a great starting point, but now you have to kind of detail how you would use these techniques to change the meaning, or how you would use some techniques to change these three determinants of intentions. Okay, so it's a good starting point. It's good to help you structure and have an idea of what you want to target, but don't stop there, because this is where the work begins, right? So I think we're kind of like getting closer to yes, kind of like we're now like, okay, we know what we want to do. We kind of know the targets, right? We know what we want to change. We don't want to let somebody else do the work. We don't want to just tell them what they should think. Andreas, running is great. We want to change them, okay? And then the last thing I think is like, and we come back to this in the rest of this lecture. The last thing is basically where a lot of like, if you come to me and say like, oh, I'm not sure what I should do, all I give you is recommendation based on the content of the previous 9 lectures, right? It's like, oh, do you remember in week 3 we did this? Do you remember in week 5 we did this? Do you remember in week 4 we did this? Why not use that? Okay, but there's a little bit like, and this kind of comes a little bit back to reinventing the wheel, right? I taught you basically, I tried to taught you, maybe that's a little bit, yes, it was like misleading. I tried to talk you, right? I tried to talk, at least talked about all these techniques, right? And these are really powerful techniques, right? These are most of the basically best validated empirical techniques to change somebody's behavior. I want you to use them. That's why we practice them in the seminars. That's why we have them, right? So if you're kind of thinking like, I want to do X, let me just go through the lectures and see where's their connecting point, right? I think a lot of what we did in these formative feedbacks was kind of like thinking in a different framework about the content that we covered, right? The stuff you listened to, you read about, etc. So one of the things is like, okay, and we come back to this because I will dive into this now a little bit deeper. But one of the biggest problems is basically just like, oh, I have my intervention, I have my problem, and the problem was not specifically mentioned in any of these lectures. So I don't have to go through the lectures. No, I go into the previously mentioned Journal of Rural Wales Health Promotion and discover something there, okay? If it doesn't resemble anything we did here, it's most likely bad, okay? There's not that much powerful stuff out there, and all the most powerful stuff I have taught you, okay? Or is in these lectures, okay? Trust this, okay? So look through the content, look through these lectures and use that knowledge. And that I think will be the most effective way to design your intervention. Okay. Another thing I just want to mention, I think for a lot of you guys, is like, oh, look into the Handbook of Wise Interventions, right? This chapter on this, the chapter on that. It's online, it's an ebook, you can look into this. There's really detailed kind of ideas about all of the major things people do. And this is like empirically validated, really good strategies, okay? Not strategies that were maybe 1 or 2 are a little bit less proven in there, but they will tell you about this, right? But that's kind of like one thing where it's like, okay, a real good resource that kind of deepen your understanding of some of these issues that you will address, okay? So if you, for instance, do something about stress, look at the Wise Interventions on stress, okay? Because having the lecture on it, we had it in the seminars, and reading this gives you the depth of knowledge of understanding of what you want to do, okay? So now, okay, so let me kind of go through a little bit. I just said I think I probably should have switched this. It's like forgetting what we did in the lectures is a little bit where I think like that's one key problem, okay? And I just want to highlight kind of some of the lessons here. And these are basically falling into 2 categories. How can you basically level up? How can you improve yours? And the other one is like how to avoid certain traps, okay? And I went through all these weeks. I mean, week 1, I had one slide from week 1. Week 1 was a week of this is what we're going to do, etc. So I kind of skipped that. But if we look at week 2, right, this was all about growth interventions, okay? We had kind of like the way I introduced that and like detailed this one growth interventions, not just because this is the best validated, best studied, best understood intervention of any kind that is out there, right? So there's nothing in parallel to it, but it's also really details. And we had a whole section on this, right? What makes an intervention a good intervention, right? And I had here kind of cheekily a little bit like brain like muscle mate, right? This is how you should not do it. And this kind of comes a little bit back to what I said, like show, don't tell, right? If you want to convince somebody of something, you have to kind of pick them up where they are at and use some effective strategies to imbue them with new meaning. And I think this, like their interventions, do it really well. We have a whole session or section chapter on what makes an intervention a good intervention. And I think there's a lot of really good content in there, right? So one of the lessons is to not just tell them, right? This is like the first slide or the first slide in that chapter where it is like a growth intervention is not simply telling people, oh, your brain works like a muscle. No, you have to do more than that, okay? So this is just to remind you that, as I said, I will go a little bit quicker through these because these are just like, okay, here's a reminder. If you feel like this applies to you in your intervention, go back to that week because I will talk about this in more detail there, okay? We had this kind of distinction that they made. There's like a growth mindset intervention when we wonder, when do they work, when do they not work? It's basically the distinction between poorly crafted and well crafted, right? And then we had this whole kind of thing where it's basically, we looked at one study that systematically with hundreds and hundreds of students looked at how to improve this intervention and how to make it specific. And it's such a rich article, but it's also such a rich section within our lectures to kind of help you guide, okay, what should I keep in mind? This is a little bit what I would suggest if you have your intervention to come back to this and say, okay, let's have a look. Did I think about all these aspects they mentioned, okay? Did I think about, and here we can kind of look at it, right, where they redesigned it to make it specific for the transition to high school, right? They have this case study. And you can think about it. Just like, okay, which labeling works better? Which kind of, should we refute bad things or should we highlight the benefits of others, okay? Should we make it specific to the audience or should we keep it general, right? And they have kind of like all of these have empirically tested, does it affect them or not, right? Here's like the framing, refuting, celebrity endorsements, etc. Okay, so here you can get a lot of pointers of, if you have your intervention, how can you make it even better? This is something clearly meant for leveling up to kind of say like, okay, I have the rough framework for my intervention. I know what I want to do. How can I make it even better? And so this article in particular, but this section of our lecture really provides a lot of ideas for that. So have a look into that. So this is good. You can kind of like, I think the growth mindset in general is such a great intervention, developed over 20 years, so much tested, rejiggered, etc. So there's a lot of in there. In week 3, we talk about wise interventions in general, and I don't want to kind of repeat the content here, but I want to point out 3 things from week 3. One thing, and that's probably like, even like, okay, I think like I'm in the range of a first. Now I want to just like, I want to go for 80s, right? Then think about effect sizes. And I come back to this, but we had a section on there to think about what makes an intervention for problem, for cause, and an intervention, right? Thinking about effect size is kind of really like high level stuff. This is the same true if you write about anything in your coursework or if you write anything about in your dissertation, right? In your research projects, right? This reflects a real deep understanding of psychology, right? It's like, oh, I don't know, narcissism correlates with 0.2 with this, right? It's like, oh, so it seems narcissism influences domestic violence, right? But the correlation is 0.2, so it's like a 4% shared variance with no control variables. So it's a tiny effect, or it's a small effect size. What can we actually make of that? It shows you a level of understanding. And I think when we talk about this, I shouldn't talk too much about this here, but when we look at this in the context of mindsets and their interventions, like, okay, what makes what kind of effects are to expect? What are effects to expect from the problems, the causes, and the mindset? That's kind of like just a little hint. If you want to really kind of go above and beyond, that's something really to do. Have you thought about the setting? We come to this and kind of look at the techniques for meaning making. And I'll say something about each of them on the next slides. I think this is a little bit where we kind of talked about is the debate about mindsets, right? Why did we talk about it? To kind of sensitize you to the idea that there is something where it's like, is it useful or not? And even if it works, is it still useful? Are these effect sizes that we're seeing useful or not, right? That kind of sensitizes us to a little bit understanding of what actually interventions can do, what we realistically should expect, and to kind of put them into context, right? It also helps you to understand if you kind of plan something or suggest something to clients, if you're actually trying to do or implement something, it's like, how solid is my empirical foundation actually for what am I doing? Okay. The other thing is like, to kind of think a little bit, oh, this is the section there's like I talk about, it's just a reminder about effect sizes. What should we take away from these effect sizes? What do they mean? It's a really good kind of sections on that, okay? The other thing is to consider context. And this is also something where I think like, this is very much about leveling up. Imagine it's like you have kind of like designed your intervention and you successfully addressed within the target population of your intervention, and they have now this new meaning, and they kind of, you made sure that they're somehow committed to that, they want to act on it, right? And now, how can you help the context after that they go back to shape in a way that enables us to integrate that? We talked about this also in week 7, or I talked about it last year. That was week 7 is the week on racism and prejudice. This is the week that I missed because of COVID, but we talked about this. And when we said like often diversity trainings are frustrating because they might instill our motivation to change something, and then I go out into my company context back again and see I can't change. So how can you enrich the environment thereafter to help them to let me show you this. How to kind of help to support these mindset effects, or help to support this new acquired meaning, or help them to support the strategies that they learn, okay? So here's like basically this kind of what we have, the mindset context perspective, right? There's a little bit of like, do you have the right population? Okay. And then they have the second step, is this a supportive context or not, right? And here they give the example when we talk about it in the lecture, we talk about it's like, oh, do you go into a classroom and the teacher doesn't believe any of that? They don't give you any opportunity to grow. They don't teach you new strategies. You failed in the last exam, and now if you're like, I have to do something different this exam, teacher help me, and the teacher doesn't, right? Then this might be really frustrating. What you want to kind of, with a supportive mindset, supportive context, what you want to trigger is these beneficial cycles where they then go out, they have a new meaning, they experience a little bit success, they get more committed to that meaning, more success, more, etc., right? Keep that in mind. That's also something that's really like to level up, right? After they leave this room, what do you think about? How could you help them implementing whatever you want them to implement in the context that is the relevant context, right? Just a quick reminder, this is the same thing. This should probably come a little bit before the context, okay? I think one of the suggestions I made to a lot of you in the formative feedback session was this, like, okay, you have something where you're trying to get them to adopt a new meaning. And now you have something like you prompt a new meaning, right? And now how you can make them commit to that. We come back to that. But don't just say, oh, here's one effective technique that helps them to discover a new meaning. So they have a prompt new meaning. Now, how can you thereafter think about how they actually commit to this, right? And we talked about in week 3 about these 4 techniques. We use them in our seminars and practice about this. But keep in mind that not to just say like, oh, I've prompted this new meaning and now I just leave you with that, right? No, make sure that you again and again really commit people, really get them to get it and to say, oh yeah, this is a powerful new perspective. And so you can use these techniques that we use. You can use something like saying is believing, which we talked ad nausea in all of our sessions, okay? Don't forget that it's not just changing meaning, but also committing people to the meaning, okay? Week 4, I think that the slide I regret the most. Week 4 is about self-identity, self-esteem, and self-affirmation. And I have the slide. It's like very few of you, to be fair, kind of did this, right? But it's like, okay, what I want to show you first is like there's certain things that do not work, and self-esteem interventions do not work or make things worse, because self-esteem is an outcome, not a cause. Okay, and I gave this kind of illusionary slide here where I said like, this is the idea that they had in the 80s, but it did not work. This is wrong, right? Diminished self-esteem stands as a powerful independent variable in the genesis of a major social problems. We all know this to be true. The real problem we must address is how we can determine that it's scientifically true, okay? What a bunch of nonsense, okay? So it's just like, oh, we know it's true, but now we have to just prove that it's true. That's not how you want to approach your research, obviously, but it's also like you can't help people by directly improving their self-esteem, right? We had this guy here, he's like this quite bizarre, I think, hard rock Nick, has a lot of problems in his life, but if you ask him, he has a very high self-esteem and high evaluation of himself. Having problems and having high self-esteem, they happily coexist with each other, okay? So self-esteem is not a cause of anything. Don't do any self-esteem intervention. This is one thing which is really important. We come back to this when we talk about prejudice. But another lesson is like you have to know what is not working, right? And you have to know the literature. And this is what I taught you, right? If you come in, it's like, oh, and then I want to do a self-esteem intervention. It's like, oh, wow, but remember week 4 when I told you for 20 minutes that that doesn't work, right? Make sure that you kind of look at that, okay? Week 5. Lessons from week 5, this was when the Doc was talking about it. We had, I think, a little bit overlooked. I had a 20-minute section there as a pre-recorded. This is one intervention where I felt like a lot of you that I mentioned several times in the formative feedback sessions, where it's like, this is a good way if people are not interested in a topic or they don't care. This utility value intervention is a good framework to kind of, and very well validated, to get students, for instance, to care, right? This is in the little presentation I recorded before that, but it might help you, okay? I think in Doc, and I thought it was kind of wonderful to see how many kind of referred back to what he said in his paper in these sessions, right? It's really about kind of like the key lesson here is like to take the perspective of the people you're addressing, the targets of your intervention, serious, okay? To not just say like, okay, NHS nurses, they don't understand how stress works, right? Let me tell them, right? And there's this other kind of the co-authoring, which kind of like we have the co-authoring of a lived experience. For instance, I think we talked a lot about this in the last week in these sessions when it's about domestic violence, for instance. How can you kind of help abused often women to co-offer a different experience, a different way of thinking about themselves, right? We practiced this a lot and aligned this when we talked about these NHS nurse intervention in our seminars. But just as a reminder, okay, take the lived experience of the people you're kind of trying to change, take that serious, right? These are people yes, that you can't just like, they have experience, they have values, these are legit, and don't just come in there and tell them, oh, you should think this, okay? Lessons from week 6. Week 6 was about crossing the Rubicon, another very popular topic. And this is a little bit where I think it's kind of two things here. So it's really kind of important if you are having more theory of planned behavior style intervention to think about where are people on the Rubicon, and then to kind of like, in order to level up, you can not only help them to cross the Rubicon, that is to form an intention, but then not kind of forget about the intention behavior gap, right? And this is something where you can really level up your intervention. So what do I mean by that? Okay, I think a lot of like discussions yesterday, I remember yesterday most vividly because it was yesterday, but also last week, you say, okay, now let's say you convince me I should run. Okay, this is an example. Let's say you're trying to have an intervention where I should try to run, but then I say I leave the intervention, it's like, oh yes, I want to run. Okay, and then about, I think, 50 to 60% who have a strong intention to do that do not act on them, or only act once and then I kind of fall off the track. Okay, so you can kind of think a little bit about how can you give me some strategies that will help me to not only form the intention. So this is for something I often suggest mental contrasting as a good strategy, but then also kind of like once you're on the other side, on the right side here of the Rubicon, all the strategies we talked about that help people to be more effective with the running, right? This could be something like implementation intention. It's like, okay, let's identify some obstacles you anticipate when you're thinking about running, and let's find some real good strategies to overcome that. So you help them basically on the left side of the Rubicon to increase the attitudes, norms, and controls. So it's more likely that they form the intention, but don't just stop there. Now, don't forget about how to actually kind of help them to tackle a lot of these problems. We talk about very specific examples. You can use them and adapt them, okay? So we kind of, even to the level of this, right? We show it's like, okay, once you have the commitment to a goal, once you formed the intention to act, here are some strategies you can use. Here's some materials. This is how you can do it. Use these. Don't invent stuff, okay? Just use the strategies we talked about. There's like, sometimes like, oh, and then I wanted to kind of help them with this or that. And I don't know, here's some strategies I heard that work. I don't know, Pomodoro timer or something like that. Use the strategies you can use a Pomodoro timer, nothing wrong with that, but try to make it in help them to implement a Pomodoro timer in a psychologically, scientifically sound way, okay? So if you feel like, oh, I formed the commitment, they really now want to do that, and it could, we talked about this, for instance, a lot of, like us, with two students I talked about is like in a framework of domestic violence, right? It's like I left the abuser, now it's kind of like, I don't want to go back, right? How can I now, they have the intention to not to go back, to separate, to move on, to protect their children. How can I help them in this goal-striving endeavor, right? It doesn't have to be running, it can be something completely different. The Rubicon still exists, right? Temptations, hesitations, etc. still exist for any of these problems, okay? Lessons from week 7, I think we're kind of nearing the end here, but here I think it's like I want to reiterate that, right? We have this is about prejudice and racism, okay? Make sure that you understand what doesn't work and make sure that you understand what works, okay? I think my lecture last year that I recorded and I shared with you was all about the kind of things that don't work. Patsy Pollock's fantastic talk was mostly on things that don't work, right? So for instance, we don't really have a good way to change implicit attitudes, okay? There's some recommendations that I shared in the video, that I also shared in articles if you want to do that. But there are some ways we know that work to change explicit attitudes. And then you can basically just read the original articles, and there's a folder and this where it's like, oh, these are things that work, right? Interventions work. And just read the articles and orient yourself, okay, towards that. Just adapt their framework and translate it into your problem, right? Don't reinvent the wheel. But it's like, once I read the original articles, they're there for a reason. They're super helpful, okay? They did basically 90% of your thinking already, and you'll see that they're really helpful. Lessons from week 9, I think harnessing reactance, big topic in the last week. Just how can you think about it? And there's like another topic that's kind of on top of that. There's a lot about respect and status, okay? And it's a little bit, let's say you want to do something for people you might not like. Okay, so I think one topic is, okay, let's say you suspect that lecturers at City University are prejudiced towards women who wear hijab, okay? So you're like, oh, these racist lecturers. And that's perfectly understandable. But if you go in with that attitude, or you design that intervention with that attitude, people will it's like the lecturers like me, we will become reactant, and we will not feel like we get the respect we want, maybe the respect we even crave, because we don't want to think of ourselves as racist, right? But the intervention tells us like, ugh, there's something wrong with you, okay? So I think we talked a lot about kind of circumventing that, right? Advice giving instead of advice receiving is much more powerful. We talked about it in week 2 as one of these interventions. This is something I said several or like probably a dozen times last week. How can you make an intervention that says like, hey, you know stuff, and how can you basically utilize their competencies and their agencies to signal them that they're respected by you, and that makes it like a much more fertile ground for behavior change, right? Don't go in there and with as much as like it might be well founded your like disliking of these people, and then kind of, but that will come through in your intervention. Okay, think about this really carefully. Okay, so these are my kind of like my recommendations for leveling up. We almost made it in time. It's like 5 minutes. What I want to say is like we will have plenty of time for any of your questions tomorrow. Okay, so if you have any questions, please, like we have seminars. Yes, we have seminars. I got this question several times. We have seminars, and we will. I will be there. Yes, I hope to meet you there. We have one seminar that will be like on a regular spot, and then we have an additional seminar at 5 p.m. that I want to do a little bit kind of like social, bring something to eat, have some fun. But it's another chance in each of these seminars tomorrow at 2, 3, 4, and 5. You can ask me any questions you have, and I'm happy to help you there as well. And I think it's often very helpful to see what other students have for questions. Okay. I really hope this was helpful. If I don't see you, I wish you a fantastic break. Good luck with your coursework. Good luck, good success, good achievements with that. I hope you find some relaxation in the last 1.5 months. And yes, good luck with your coursework for this seminar. And it was a real pleasure to have the opportunity to teach you guys. Okay, see you soon.